New York Red Alert. What if the most dangerous thing about New York today is not what makes the headlines, but what has quietly become normal? The city that once symbolized ambition, safety through movement, and opportunity now flashes red warning signals that most people are trained to ignore. New York still sells itself as the capital of the world, but beneath the lights, the branding, and the mythology, an invisible alert system is constantly active. It is not announced on billboards. It is felt in tension, behavior, and risk patterns that travelers and residents experience every single day. The idea of a red alert zone in New York sounds exaggerated until you start paying attention to how the city actually functions. Airports overwhelmed and unpredictable, transit systems strained beyond capacity, public spaces that demand constant vigilance instead of offering rest. This is not about isolated crime stories or sensational headlines. It is about structural stress leaking into daily life. A city under pressure does not collapse overnight. It frays, it hardens, it forces people to adapt in ways that slowly raise the baseline of acceptable danger. For decades, New York was marketed as intense but manageable, chaotic but rewarding, expensive but worth it. That balance is breaking. The modern traveler arrives expecting energy and opportunity, but instead encounters friction, confusion, and unease. The signs are subtle but consistent. Increased warnings, areas quietly reclassified as risky, behaviors locals adopt instinctively without explanation. These are not accidents. They are symptoms of a system operating beyond its sustainable limits. What makes this moment different is not that New York has problems. It always has. What makes it different is how openly the city now relies on denial to function. Instead of fixing root causes, risk is redistributed. Instead of restoring stability, danger is normalized. Visitors are told to stay alert. Residents are told to adapt. And the city continues to move forward as if this state of permanent alert were just another feature of urban life. This is where the illusion cracks. A healthy city does not require constant psychological armor. It does not force people to scan every space, calculate every move, and lower their expectations of safety just to participate in daily routines. When entire zones demand heightened awareness, the issue is no longer individual behavior. It is systemic failure, presenting itself as inconvenience. And here is the uncomfortable truth most narratives avoid. These red alert zones are not random. They follow patterns: infrastructure strain, social pressure, economic exclusion, institutional silence. Together, they form a map of risk that tells a deeper story about what New York has become and where it may be heading next. Before naming specific places, it matters to understand why these zones exist at all. Because once you see the structure behind the alert, you start to realize this is not just about travelers. It is about a city redefining what danger means and quietly asking everyone to accept it as normal. If this feels uncomfortable, that reaction matters. Because understanding what is happening beneath the surface of cities like New York is no longer optional. It is essential. This is not about fear, and it is not about exaggeration. It is about learning to read the signals that urban life quietly sends before breakdown becomes impossible to ignore. When you understand these patterns, you stop seeing chaos as random and start recognizing how systems fail slowly, right in front of everyone. If you have lived in New York, visited recently, or felt this tension in any major city, your perspective adds real value here. Take a moment to leave a comment and describe what you noticed, even if it was subtle. Did the city feel different, more guarded, more exhausting? Sharing these experiences helps expose what official narratives avoid discussing. If this analysis is helping you see urban life more clearly, make sure to leave a like. It tells the platform this kind of content matters. And if you want deeper, unfiltered breakdowns of modern cities, infrastructure stress, and the hidden cost of the urban dream, consider subscribing so you do not miss what comes next. The moment a city begins issuing quiet warnings instead of bold promises, something fundamental has already shifted. New York today operates less like a symbol of opportunity and more like a system in permanent mitigation mode. You can feel it the instant you arrive. not through a single dramatic event, but through layers of friction stacked on top of each other, signs telling you what not to do, announcements reminding you to stay alert, barriers, rerouted flows, security theater that feels routine rather than exceptional. This is what an urban emergency looks like when it becomes normalized. Cities under stress rarely declare crises. They manage perception instead. New York has mastered this. The language changes subtly. Problems are rebranded as inconveniences. Risks become part of the experience. Travelers are warned to be vigilant without being told why vigilance is now required everywhere. Residents internalize it even faster. They learn which subway cars to avoid, which blocks feel wrong at certain hours, which moments demand full situational awareness. None of this appears in glossy campaigns, yet it defines daily survival. Here is the first uncomfortable twist. Emergency mode does not arrive because of one failure. It arrives when multiple systems degrade at the same time. Transportation becomes unreliable. Housing becomes unreachable. Public order weakens not explosively, but unevenly. The result is a city that still functions, but only by transferring stress onto individuals. You are expected to compensate for infrastructure gaps with attention, caution, and psychological endurance. Another shift follows quietly. Trust erodes, not just trust in safety, but trust in predictability. When routines stop feeling stable, the brain remains on edge. Airports become pressure points instead of gateways. Transit hubs feel like tests rather than tools. Public spaces lose their role as neutral ground and become zones of calculation. This is not paranoia. It is adaptation to an environment that no longer guarantees baseline security. The second twist is more subtle. As emergency conditions stretch on, people stop noticing them. What once felt alarming becomes background noise. Constant alerts lose their urgency. Warnings blend into routine announcements. This is how cities drift into silent collapse without visible chaos. Not because danger spikes dramatically, but because tolerance expands. The abnormal becomes ordinary. For travelers, this creates confusion. They arrive expecting intensity, culture, movement. What they encounter instead is a city asking them to self-manage risk. For residents, the cost is heavier. Living in a place that never fully relaxes reshapes behavior, health, and expectations. Stress becomes ambient. Exhaustion feels earned rather than imposed. Leaving starts to feel like relief instead of failure. Ask yourself this: when a city requires constant alertness just to move through it, is it still functioning as a city or merely surviving as a system? That question matters, because the zones labeled as risky are only the most visible expression of a deeper condition. And the next layer of this story becomes impossible to ignore once we look at where pressure concentrates the most. The fastest way to understand a city in decline is to look at how it moves people. Not its skyline, not its branding, but its arteries. Airports, subway systems, terminals, and transfer zones reveal stress long before neighborhoods do. In New York, these spaces no longer feel like infrastructure designed for flow. They feel like pressure chambers. Places where time stretches, tempers shorten, and uncertainty becomes routine. Airports used to symbolize entry into the city of possibility. Today, they operate as early warning systems. Delays cascade without explanation. Security feels both omnipresent and ineffective. Crowds pile up with no clear information, no sense of control, and no margin for error. What should be transitional space becomes a prolonged test of patience and vigilance. This is not simply mismanagement. It is the visible result of systems stretched beyond what they were built to handle. Then comes the subway, once the great equalizer of New York. Fast, brutal, democratic. Now it reflects the city's fractures with uncomfortable clarity. Aging infrastructure struggles under constant demand. Maintenance happens reactively, not preventively. Riders learn to expect disruptions as a baseline condition. Stations feel less like connectors and more like thresholds where risk perception shifts block by block, hour by hour. Here is the first narrative turn most people miss. Infrastructure does not fail loudly at first. It fails psychologically. When you cannot trust a system to behave predictably, you change how you move. You leave earlier than necessary. You avoid certain routes. You stay hyper-aware. Over time, that constant calculation becomes exhausting. The city demands not just time and money, but cognitive energy. A second, deeper layer emerges when public spaces lose their sense of neutrality. Transit hubs become zones where multiple social pressures collide: homelessness, policing, mental health crises, economic exclusion. None of these issues are new, but the systems meant to buffer them have weakened. The result is not chaos, but tension. A low-level hum of unease that never fully shuts off. This is where the idea of zones becomes real. Not official maps, but lived geography. Areas defined by how much attention they require, how quickly things can escalate, how little room there is for error. Travelers sense this immediately, even if they cannot articulate it. Residents map it instinctively. And here is the unsettling insight. When the city's main arteries become stress points, the problem is no longer localized. It is structural. Movement itself becomes costly. Rest becomes rare. The city keeps functioning, but only by extracting more resilience from the people inside it. Tourist zones are supposed to be the safest parts of a city. They are designed, marketed, and maintained to reassure outsiders, cleaned more often, patrolled more visibly, framed as controlled environments where risk feels distant. In New York, that promise is breaking down, and nowhere is the contrast more unsettling than in places still sold as secure, iconic, and welcoming. What used to feel curated now feels exposed. Areas once defined by spectacle and comfort increasingly demand alertness. Crowds are denser, but support feels thinner. The presence of security is obvious, yet reassurance is missing. This is the paradox travelers notice first. Visibility without safety, movement without ease. A place can look protected and still feel unstable. That gap between appearance and experience is one of the clearest signals of urban strain. Here is the first major turn in this story. Tourist areas are not becoming risky because they are neglected. They are becoming risky because they are overloaded. They absorb pressure from every direction at once. Visitors, commuters, service workers, informal economies, surveillance systems, and social crises all converge in the same limited space. When too many roles are forced onto the same environment, stability weakens. Control becomes reactive. Prevention becomes performative. A second shift follows quietly. Expectations collapse. Travelers arrive believing these zones are insulated from the city's deeper problems. When reality contradicts that belief, stress spikes. Confusion replaces confidence. Small disruptions feel larger because they violate the narrative people were sold. This is why discomfort in these areas feels sharper than in unfamiliar neighborhoods. The betrayal is psychological, not just practical. There is also a human cost hidden in plain sight. The workers who keep these zones functioning operate under constant strain. They manage crowds that never thin out, moods that shift unpredictably, and risks they are trained not to name out loud. Over time, emotional labor replaces service. Vigilance replaces hospitality. The space stops offering relief and starts demanding endurance. Here is the uncomfortable insight most marketing avoids. When tourist zones degrade, it means the city has lost its ability to compartmentalize stress. Problems are no longer contained. They leak into the most visible symbolic spaces first, not because those areas are weakest, but because they are the most exposed. They carry the weight of the city's image while absorbing its unresolved tensions. For visitors, this creates a constant background calculation: where to stand, when to move, how long to stay. For residents, it confirms something deeper. If even the safest, most curated parts of the city feel unstable, then nowhere is truly insulated anymore. The red zones are no longer exceptions. They are warnings. A city that never sleeps eventually forgets how to rest. In New York, constant stimulation used to feel energizing. Today, it feels compulsory. The noise is no longer just sound, it is cognitive. Sirens, alerts, announcements, interruptions, crowds that never thin out, decisions that never pause. The city does not offer recovery time. It demands readiness. And when readiness becomes permanent, stress stops being a reaction and turns into a condition. Here is the shift most people underestimate. Chronic alertness reshapes behavior long before it shows up as burnout. People move faster even when they do not need to. They scan faces, exits, and surroundings automatically. Small inconveniences trigger outsized frustration because the nervous system is already saturated. This is not individual weakness. It is an environment training people to live in defensive mode. The first narrative turn appears here. What looks like personal anxiety is often collective pressure expressed privately. Millions of people sharing the same overstimulated spaces create feedback loops. One tense interaction amplifies the next. Crowded platforms, packed sidewalks, delayed trains, and unpredictable encounters stack emotional load minute by minute. Over time, patience erodes not because people are worse, but because the margin for calm has disappeared. Then comes a deeper layer. When stress becomes ambient, people stop labeling it as stress. They call it ambition, hustle, the cost of living in a world-class city. Language adapts to protect the myth. But the body does not negotiate. Sleep shortens. Focus fragments. Irritability increases. The city keeps functioning because people push through, not because conditions support them. The second twist is more unsettling. Constant pressure distorts judgment. What once felt unacceptable starts to feel inevitable. Risk is tolerated. Discomfort is normalized. This is how cities slide into long-term decline without a single dramatic moment. Not through collapse, but through adaptation to conditions that should never have become normal. Public spaces reflect this shift clearly. Parks no longer feel restorative. Cafes feel temporary. Even moments of stillness carry background tension. People remain half present, half alert, as if something might happen at any moment. That psychological posture follows travelers home and residents to bed. The city extends beyond its borders through stress alone. This is why the idea of red alert zones cannot be limited to geography. The most dangerous zone is often internal, a state where the city demands constant vigilance and offers no psychological shelter in return. When a place cannot provide rest, it slowly extracts health, clarity, and resilience from everyone inside it. Every red alert zone has a hidden ledger, and it is written in human cost. Behind every warning sign, every advisory to stay alert, every space that quietly demands caution, there are people absorbing the impact day after day. Not as headlines, not as statistics, as lived strain. New York's risk zones are not abstract concepts. They are environments where stress, exclusion, and exhaustion concentrate and compound. The first layer of this cost appears among those with the least flexibility. Service workers, transit employees, cleaners, security staff, delivery drivers. These are the people who cannot choose safer routes or quieter hours. They move through the city when it is most volatile, most compressed, most unforgiving. While travelers experience risk as discomfort, these workers experience it as routine exposure. Vigilance is not optional. It is part of the job description, even when no one names it that way. Then comes the second turn, more subtle, but more corrosive. Emotional labor replaces stability. Workers are expected to remain calm in spaces that no longer support calm, to manage crowds that arrive already stressed, to absorb frustration generated by systems they do not control. Over time, this produces a specific kind of fatigue, not just physical tiredness, but moral exhaustion. The feeling of being responsible for holding together environments that are structurally fraying. Residents living near these zones carry a different burden. Their neighborhoods become transitional spaces rather than communities. Streets are treated as corridors, not places to linger. Familiarity erodes as turnover accelerates. People move in briefly, leave quickly, or disappear quietly. This churn breaks social memory. When neighbors stop knowing each other, informal safety networks collapse. Risk increases not because people are worse, but because connection weakens. Here is the next narrative shift. Gentrification does not remove danger. It redistributes it. Rising costs push vulnerable populations into tighter margins, while wealthier newcomers remain psychologically detached. The result is parallel realities occupying the same space. One group navigates risk consciously. The other pretends it is temporary or irrelevant. That mismatch amplifies tension. Misunderstanding replaces empathy. Silence replaces accountability. The most invisible cost appears in how people adjust their expectations of life. Dreams shrink, plans become shorter term, people stop imagining permanence. When staying feels conditional, everything becomes provisional. Careers, relationships, homes. This is not ambition fading, it is trust dissolving. Trust that the city will reward effort rather than extract it. Red alert zones reveal this truth brutally. They are not just dangerous because something might happen. They are dangerous because they teach people to live with less certainty, less rest, and less hope than a healthy city should ever demand. And once a city trains its population to endure instead of thrive, decline no longer needs a crisis to advance. The most dangerous stage of urban decline is not chaos. It is familiarity. In New York, risk no longer arrives as a shock. It arrives as background noise. Sirens blend into traffic. Warnings blend into routine announcements. Behaviors once associated with emergencies are now simply how the city works. This is how danger loses its power to alarm and gains the ability to persist. Normalization begins quietly. People adjust without discussion. Routes change, hours shift, expectations lower. What once would have triggered outrage now produces resignation. The city does not feel safe or unsafe anymore. It feels managed. Controlled just enough to continue operating, unstable enough to keep everyone alert. That balance is not accidental. It is how systems survive when they cannot be repaired. Here is the first narrative turn. When danger becomes routine, institutions stop responding with urgency. They respond with messaging. Language replaces action. Signs instruct people to be cautious. Campaigns encourage awareness. Responsibility shifts from systems to individuals. If something goes wrong, the failure is framed as personal misjudgment rather than structural neglect. The city absolves itself by teaching people to self-monitor. Then comes a deeper distortion. Collective memory shortens. People forget what normal used to feel like. Younger residents grow up assuming constant alertness is part of urban adulthood. Travelers internalize stress as the price of access. Even discomfort becomes something to be endured silently. Complaining feels naive. Expecting ease feels unrealistic. This is how decline stabilizes itself psychologically. The second turn is more unsettling. Normalization creates blind spots. When everything feels slightly off all the time, it becomes harder to notice real escalation. Signals blur together. True emergencies struggle to stand out against a backdrop of permanent tension. This is not resilience, it is desensitization. And desensitized environments are fragile, not strong. Public behavior reflects this shift clearly. People avoid eye contact, intervene less, assume someone else will handle it. Community responsibility dissolves into private survival strategies. Each person carries their own map of red zones, rarely shared, rarely questioned. The city fragments into overlapping personal risk calculations instead of shared civic space. There is also a moral cost. When danger is normalized, empathy erodes. People stop seeing stress in others because it mirrors their own. The line between acceptable and unacceptable behavior blurs. Small violations accumulate. Boundaries weaken. The city does not collapse outwardly. It hollows inwardly. This is why normalization is not neutrality. It is active decay disguised as adaptation. A city that teaches people to expect less safety, less care, and less stability is not preparing them for the future. It is asking them to accept decline as maturity. When a city begins warning visitors while quietly pushing residents out, the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. New York now speaks two languages at once. To tourists, it says, stay alert, plan carefully, know where you are. To residents, it says nothing at all, except through rising rents, shrinking space, and a daily grind that quietly suggests you no longer belong. This is how a city empties without ever announcing an evacuation. The first shift appears in who can tolerate uncertainty. Travelers experience risk temporarily. They leave. Residents live inside it indefinitely. Over time, the ability to endure constant alertness becomes a form of selection. Those with resources insulate themselves. Those without adapt until adaptation becomes exhaustion. Eventually, leaving feels less like a choice and more like a necessity. Here is the first narrative turn. Urban flight today is rarely dramatic. It does not look like panic or collapse. It looks like quiet calculation. Families delay plans, then cancel them. Professionals stop renewing leases. Longtime residents realize they are paying more for less peace, less space, and less certainty. The city does not push them out directly. It makes staying psychologically expensive. Tourism exposes this tension clearly. Visitors are told where to be cautious, but not why. Those cautions exist. They move through zones residents have already learned to avoid. They sense something is off, but lack context. Meanwhile, locals carry an invisible map shaped by experience. Which hours feel wrong? Which platforms feel unstable? Which blocks demand attention? That knowledge is never written down. It is earned through exposure. The second turn is more revealing. As residents leave, the city loses memory. Not cultural memory, but functional memory. People who knew how spaces used to work, who recognized early warning signs, who maintained informal order disappear. What remains is a city optimized for short-term presence rather than long-term life. Apartments become temporary. Neighborhoods feel interchangeable. The sense of home dissolves. This creates a feedback loop. Fewer rooted residents mean weaker community bonds. Weaker bonds mean higher perceived risk. Higher risk accelerates departure. The city compensates by attracting more visitors, more turnover, more surface-level energy. But movement without stability does not produce health. It produces volatility. Here is the insight most narratives avoid. A city that becomes easier to visit than to live in is already in trouble. Tourism can mask decline, but it cannot reverse it. Warning travelers while losing residents is not a strategy. It is a symptom. For the people who stay, the cost is subtle but heavy. They begin to imagine elsewhere. Not because they failed, but because the city changed the terms. And once enough people start imagining leaving, the collapse no longer needs a catalyst. It unfolds quietly, lease by lease, goodbye by goodbye. Every system in decline depends on silence to survive. In New York, that silence is not accidental. It is produced, maintained, and rewarded. Institutions do not deny problems outright. They soften them. They rename them. They frame them as temporary, localized, or exaggerated. What cannot be solved structurally is managed narratively. And over time, that narrative becomes louder than reality itself. The first layer of denial appears in language. Risk becomes complexity. Degradation becomes transition. Warnings are presented as precaution, never as admission. When cities talk this way, they are not informing people. They are conditioning them. Conditioning them to accept friction as sophistication and stress as inevitability. The message is subtle but consistent. If you struggle here, the problem is you, not the city. Here comes the first narrative turn. Media coverage mirrors this logic. Individual incidents are isolated, dissected, and then discarded. The connective tissue is never explored. Stories are framed as anomalies instead of symptoms. Viewers are given events without context, moments without structure. This keeps the larger pattern invisible. You can be aware of everything and understand nothing. Then there is the deeper silence, cultural denial, the reluctance to say out loud that the myth is breaking. New York still occupies a sacred place in the global imagination. Questioning it feels almost taboo. Criticism is interpreted as weakness, nostalgia, or resistance to progress. This social pressure keeps people quiet, even when their lived experience contradicts the image. They joke about it, normalize it, move on. The second turn is more unsettling. Denial becomes a coping mechanism for residents themselves, a way to preserve identity. Admitting that the city is failing feels like admitting personal failure. So people rationalize. They say it has always been this way. They say every city is like this now. They say it is still worth it, even when the trade-offs no longer make sense. This is how loyalty turns into self-protection. Institutional silence thrives in this environment. When discomfort is normalized and critique is discouraged, urgency evaporates. Problems age without solutions. Temporary measures become permanent. The city learns that it can function without fixing itself, as long as people keep adapting. That is not resilience. It is deferred collapse. You can see the cost of this denial everywhere. In infrastructure that is patched instead of rebuilt. In policies that respond to optics rather than outcomes. In public messaging that asks for patience instead of accountability. Silence does not mean nothing is wrong. It means too much is wrong to confront honestly. This is why red alert zones matter beyond safety. They puncture the narrative. They expose the gap between what is said and what is felt. They force acknowledgement, even if only briefly. And once that gap becomes visible, it raises a dangerous question for any myth-based system. What else have we been trained not to see? When a city like New York begins issuing red alerts in fragments, the mistake is to see them as isolated warnings. They are not. They are symptoms of a broader pattern that extends far beyond a single metropolis. What is happening here is not unique, only concentrated. New York functions as an early indicator, a pressure test for what happens when ambition, density, inequality, and infrastructure collide without correction. The first insight at this final layer is uncomfortable. Cities do not fail because they are too big. They fail because they outgrow their ability to care for the people inside them. When maintenance becomes reactive, when risk is managed instead of reduced, when people are asked to adapt endlessly, the city shifts from being a platform for life to a machine for extraction. Time, money, attention, health, everything is consumed to keep the system moving. Here comes the first major turn. What looks like resilience is often just deferred cost. New York still functions, still attracts, still dazzles on the surface. But function without recovery is not strength. It is depletion. The warning zones highlight where the system is closest to its limits, but the logic behind them spreads everywhere. Once vigilance becomes a requirement, the entire city operates under strain, even in places not officially labeled as risky. The second turn reframes the idea of collapse itself. Collapse does not have to be dramatic to be real. It can be incremental, invisible, and polite. It happens when people quietly lower expectations, when safety becomes conditional, when rest becomes rare, when leaving feels rational rather than tragic. This is not the end of a city. It is the slow erosion of what made it worth enduring in the skyline. First place. New York's red zones reveal a truth many global cities are approaching. Growth without balance produces instability. Density without care produces tension. And mythology without honesty produces denial. The danger is not that travelers face risk in certain zones. The danger is that entire urban systems are being redesigned around managing stress instead of preventing it. This is why New York matters as a case study, not because it is failing faster, but because it is failing first. What becomes normalized here sets the tone elsewhere. Other cities watch, learn, and repeat the same compromises. Over time, the idea of what urban life should feel like is rewritten downward. The final realization is simple, but heavy. A city that trains people to accept constant alertness has already crossed a line. When vigilance replaces trust, when adaptation replaces care, the red alert is no longer about place. It is about direction. If you stayed until this point, it means you are not just watching, you are thinking. And that matters more than ever. Cities do not change because of slogans or marketing. They change when people start questioning what they are being asked to accept as normal. If this analysis helped you see New York, or urban life in general, with clearer eyes, take a moment now to subscribe to the channel. This is where we break down what official narratives leave out. If you reach the end, leave a comment with the phrase "Red Alert Accepted" so I know you followed the entire thread and understood the deeper message behind these warning zones. Your comment helps push this conversation into spaces where it is usually avoided. And if this video made you pause, reflect, or rethink the urban dream you were sold, leave a like. It signals that this kind of sober, honest analysis still has a place. On your screen right now, another video is waiting, one that continues exposing the hidden mechanics behind modern cities and their silent collapse. Click it and let's keep pulling this apart together.